Okay, hang on a minute. I don't want to start the recording yet. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Dave Small, the president of the Athol Bird Nature Club. I want to welcome you to our September meeting of the Athol Bird Nature Club, and we're very pleased to have with us some advocates and experts on the idea of rodenticides and how much harm they do in the environment. From my own experience, 2 years ago, I had a rat problem in my own yard. I have a neighbor that has chickens and whatnot, and it really took a little effort to find someone that would come and deal with the rat issue without using any of those rodenticides or whatever. And it maybe have cost me a little bit extra, but he was able to using containment traps or whatever, and we got rid of the problem, and I haven't had a problem since. So I know it can be done, and I think it's something that we really need to be cognizant of as we move in the future about what we're doing in our own yards and our own backyards. That's really important. A lot of things that commercial people could do or wouldn't be able to do. Homeowners can get these kind of things and put them in their yard, and without any regulation or actually using any of the good advice and rules of the label. So it's real important that as homeowners, we're really very cognizant of all those things. So with that said, I want to turn it over to Martha, who's going to introduce our speakers and get us started tonight.
Hi, everybody. I'm Martha Ruhlman, and I've lived in Western Massachusetts for many, many years, and now kind of go between Western Mass, Northfield, Mass, and Southwestern New Hampshire and Cape Cod. I originally got involved with this when I went to a program a year ago or so that Heather Packard did. Stephanie Ellis was at that program too. It was a kickoff on Cape Cod for their Rescue Raptors group. And that's when I really started getting involved in this. I was kind of vaguely aware of the rodenticide problem. And about 10 years or so ago, I started noticing these strange boxes all over the place. And ever since I went to that kickoff a year ago, I've gotten very involved in this campaign. I'm also involved in a fairly newly formed group in New Hampshire called Rodenticide Free New Hampshire. So anybody tuning in from New Hampshire, please check out their Facebook page. A lot of people that I talk to have stories and in their own neighborhoods where they find injured or dead wildlife. Just recently, a neighbor of mine told me about a neighbor of hers who found an injured owl, a blinded owl, and he brought it into a local wildlife rehabilitator, and it had to be euthanized. And this is just going on everywhere. And when I really realized the impact, the wide-ranging impact this is having, I felt like I had to try to do something. So I really appreciate Laura and Stephanie doing this program. Laura and Stephanie both do amazing work. And also thank you to Dave for hosting this program. I know he was very happy to do it. And I just want to get the message out how harmful these poisons are. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. So I think I will be starting the program. I'm just going to share my screen. And then I will enlarge this. And hopefully everyone can see. Just a few quick slides about who I am. So I am the director of WildCare. WildCare is a wildlife rehabilitation hospital located on Cape Cod. We are in Eastham, and we treat approximately 1,800 animals per year. And animals that are brought to us or rescued are typically sick, injured, or orphaned. And I just have a little breakdown here showing that the majority of the animals brought to us are, in fact, birds. And we are a nonprofit organization, and our mission is to rescue and rehabilitate sick, injured, and orphan wildlife with the goal of release back into the wild. And almost as importantly, I feel education is so key. We give talks throughout Cape Cod, throughout the year, teaching people how to reduce impacts on wildlife and essentially how we can coexist. And then on to our topic. So at a wildlife rehabilitation facility, we do see, unfortunately, a lot of casualties of rodenticide poisoning. And poison is really not the answer, as you will hear tonight. In fact, the irony is that we're killing many of our large predators, like our birds of prey, by using rodent poison because they get secondary poisoning. And so raptors are actually more effective at rodent control than poison. This is a broad-winged hawk on the left. This is a screech owl that was trapped in a glue plate, which is a separate issue and topic, and a great horned owl that had suffered from rodenticide poisoning. So let's first discuss the dilemma. And this is an eastern screech owl. We received a call about a screech owl that had been on a lamp post for a day at someone's home. And when we admitted it, it showed symptoms of rodenticide exposure, which was that the bird was had been bleeding out and had blood on its feathers and had severe anemia. And I'll explain why that happens. But the dilemma is, so you're all familiar with now, it's become kind of a buzzword, bait boxes, which are often these black boxes that you see outside of businesses and schools, etc. And they contain poison bait. And these boxes were rare prior to 2015. And I actually got that information from Laura Kiesel, who you will meet next. And the use of these boxes has been driven by the increased population that we see not just on Cape Cod, but in New England, and construction efforts. And this is also because of public health regulations, where many local boards of health, they need to approve new construction, and many towns are requiring rodent management strategies, including poison and bait stations. And so we've really seen a boom in the use of these bait boxes. In 2022, Massachusetts commercial applicators used over 500,000 pounds of anticoagulant rodenticides, which I will explain. Some of these are the most harmful products out there and can cause secondary poisoning to children, pets, and wildlife. Another part of our problem is that we as humans, we seek a quick fix. We always want a quick solution. And even though poisons may work by eliminating rodents, it actually does not solve the problem, and rodents will continue to return and increase. Overall, if rat poisons really worked, wouldn't we have eradicated them long ago? So poisons truly do not work long term. So what happens is when you use products we'll talk about second generation anticoagulants. When you use rat and mouse poisons that are anticoagulants, what happens is rats or mice consume these products and they become debilitated and they become easy prey for raptors or mammal predators like foxes and coyotes. And when the foxes, coyotes, and raptors consume these poison rodents, they are exposed to secondary poisoning. And it depends on the type of product that the mouse or rat ingested and depends on the level of exposure from the predator. But I can tell you that at WildCare, nearly every large raptor that we receive has some level of rodenticide poisoning. And that's quite sad for us to see. Honestly, I used to think, oh my gosh, this is just a city problem, where there's buildings everywhere and they're controlling rodents with poisons, and it's not. It's a huge problem even on Cape Cod, which is very much a nature-loving community. And so here's an example. This was a red-tailed hawk that was rescued in Wellfleet. It was found slumped over in the middle of the road. It was severely anemic. It exhibited blindness. And what happens with these anticoagulant rodenticides, it inhibits the blood's ability to clot. And so when mice and rats ingest it, they bleed out, they get dehydrated, bleed out, and die. And the same occurs with secondary poisoning. So raptors often, they might be actively bleeding, they might show bruising, and always anemia and weakness. And sometimes they actually exhibit blindness. And so um, we don't test for a diagnosis. We treat the symptoms. So if a bird comes in and it checks off many of these boxes, we go ahead and we start a treatment of fluids and vitamin K therapy. Vitamin K basically tells the blood to clot. And so we can save some of these birds, but quite honestly, when they're at the point where they are actively bleeding out, often that requires a blood transfusion, and you're working with an incredibly critical animal, and it's harder to save them. We look at blood clotting time. So that's one of the symptoms. This was a snowy owl that we rescued from Wellfleet a few years ago, and sadly, this bird had what we refer to as end-stage rodenticide poisoning, and we were not able to save this bird. It was already at the point where it was actively bleeding and had bruising. But you better believe, being an apex predator that's here in the winter and we all love them and we flock to them. I use this bird as sort of an icon and got on my soapbox to educate people about the harmful impacts of rodenticides. And these are just a few stats. So Tufts has really led the way over the years in bringing this issue to our awareness. They've done studies in their wildlife hospital in Grafton. In one study, they looked at 1 hawk species and 3 owl species admitted to their clinic between 2006 and 2010. And of 161 birds, 86% tested positive for anticoagulant rodenticides. And for 94 birds tested between 2012 and 2017, 96 were positive. And this is in Grafton. And Grafton, of course, they're surrounded by, there's city there, but also there are many parts of Grafton that are open spaces, rolling hills, and horse farms. And again, I just want to remind you that this is not just a city problem. They also learned in their hospital, and we've learned from other research in California, that large mammals also, this is a huge risk to large mammals like our fox and coyote, and then bobcat and mountain lions. And rodenticide has also been linked to mange in carnivores. So mange being a little microscopic mite that goes under the skin. And mange is typically cyclical, and some animals can fight it off. What research has found is that mammals exposed to rodenticides, they are immunocompromised and have less of an ability to fight off mange. And then this information is really, really important, and I don't expect anyone to remember all of this. I do have this information listed on our website, wildcarecapecod.org, and there is a little drop-down tab for humane rodent solutions. So please don't feel like you have to write these things down. They are available to you, or I can email you the information. But so the types of rodenticides, first generation rodenticides, are still available on shelves, and these products have a shorter elimination half-life, meaning they require higher concentrations and repeat ingestion for mice, for example, to get a lethal dose. Second generation anticoagulant rodenticides are more potent. They are often lethal to a rodent in a single feeding, a single dose. They were introduced in the 1970s to combat resistance to the first generation rodenticides. And what happened was, after several poisonings of children and pets, EPA in 2014 rodenticides outlawed second generation rodenticides for consumer use. So the only way that these rodenticides can be distributed is through your local licensed pest control company. And then this is just a list of the products that represent second generation anticoagulants, which again can only be distributed by pest control companies. And then first generation anticoagulants, which are still found on our shelves, sadly, are products like Radol, Ground Force. And we'll talk about some other products that are also rodenticides, but are not anticoagulant. This was a baby red-tailed hawk that was brought to us after it was found on a deck. No parents around. It was very weak. And unfortunately, this bird was actively bleeding. We tried our best, but we weren't able to save this one. But we do save as many as we possibly can, and that's what keeps us going and is impetus for us to get this information out there. So I want you to know the pest control companies, I've met with them, I've spoken with them. There are companies who I've spoken with who they want to do the right thing and they don't want to use poisons. And so what's happening is they don't want to be the bad guy. And so what they are often pushing people to use instead of the rodenticides is cholecalciferol, which is vitamin D3, commonly sold as in these products, Decon, Rampage, Terad 3. And so vitamin D3, it is safer for wildlife in that there is a very, low risk of secondary poisoning to wildlife and an extremely low risk to birds. The challenge here is that if canines eat it directly, for example, if a bait box is broken and they have access to these bait, it often causes death. It can be fatal to dogs. And there is a risk of, if anything like a bird or any wildlife ingests it directly, there is a risk of poisoning there. But the secondary poisoning risk is low. And so is it safer? Yes. Are there still concerns? Absolutely, yes. But when people tell me they've tried all the things, which I'm going to list for you in a few slides, and all of that failed, and they want to use this, it is more humane. It just has these risks. These are just a few more stats, because if you can imagine, so part of the problem is these bait boxes, rodents don't sit in the boxes and consume the bait. Rodents like to store things. And so rodents are moving the bait to other places. And here's where we run the risk of children or pets directly consuming the bait. And so this is a serious issue. And you can see here, between 1999 and 2009, over 15,000 children under the age of 6 were exposed to rodenticides. And unfortunately, we often have fatalities of pets. Oops, sorry, my screen just, oops. I just lost my presentation for some reason. There it is. Okay. And I also want to share that these bait boxes, so we're going to talk about how to deter or control your rodent population humanely and long term. And one of the main things that you need to do is to remove the attractants. And so with the bait boxes, when you have this bait that's attracting rodents and then it's being refilled every couple of weeks, we refer to this as the bait box scam because you're actually attracting rodents to that area. It's not solving the problem. So even though it may be, it's killing the rodents as they consume it, more rodents are moving in because they're attracted to the bait. And what happens also is some predators learn to wait outside of the bait boxes because you have these sick or weak mice that are coming and going, taking the pellets, they're easy prey. And so they are having, these birds of prey especially are having direct access to exposure. I hope that makes sense. And as I mentioned earlier, but I hope it makes even more sense now, rat poison is killing our larger predators and actually worsening the rodent problem because the predators are going away. And this is just a few more studies that show how, for example, a barn owl can eat over 1,500 rodents in a year. And so a family of barn owls can eat over 3,000 rodents in a year, which certainly helps to curb rodent overpopulations in a healthy and organic way. And there was a study in Ventura County where hawks and owls were released into heavy rodent areas. And over 17 months, the birds reduced burrowing damage by 50% more than the anticoagulant rodenticides used in a control study. Okay, so let's talk about the alternatives. So what you really need to do if you want to control rodents is to take a multifaceted approach. And we refer to this as IPM, integrated pest management. And so the first thing you need to look at is what are the food sources? What are the attractants? And how can we get rid of them? And so one of the things is outside bird feeders. You can always take them in at night or use the shell-free bird food so that you don't have a lot of waste on the ground. Also dog feces, there's a lot of mixed opinions about this, but some sources say that rats are attracted to dog feces for the undigested materials. Anyway, you want to eliminate your food sources. Practice good refuse management. If you have dumpsters and garbage cans that are always open or accessible, of course, rodents are going to, that's a buffet. Also, there are many great rodent-proof compost bins available now that are helpful because, of course, compost, even though we're doing a good thing, that is food matter and can attract rodents. It's also recommended that you trim your foliage around your house so that it is greater than 2 feet from your home or dwelling. And this is to prevent animals from hiding in it and then moving into dwellings. And of course, rats, they can climb vines and climb vegetation that is right up against your home. And then really, really key, after you've removed the food sources and try to determine how they're getting in, you want to seal up all entry points. And using a 1/4-inch hardware cloth works. I have actually done this myself in my home. I live in the woods and I had a breach of mice into my apartment. And sealing it up with steel wool or really coarse or marine grade steel wool that you stuff into all the cracks or crevices, and then you can spray it with a foam insulation. And they actually make a foam, it's called mouse shield, and it seals it in. And then the mice, even if they chew it, they don't want to get through that prickly steel wool. And I can totally testify that this works. I had caught like 21 mice in my apartment over the period of 2 weeks, and I was doing trap and release and putting them outside. And of course, some of them probably came right back in, but eventually I found all the holes and prevented mice from coming back in. And I haven't had a breach, so I hope that remains the same. And so I have to say that I most recently learned, I used to recommend electronic zappers, but I recently learned that these electronic products are not actually humane because the death often isn't immediate. There's a lapse there between the brain and the heart stopping. So I will let you make your own opinion on that. But I no longer recommend them. But I do feel snap traps are far more humane than utilizing any poisons. If you do use snap traps, I recommend not using them during the summer when there are babies that you are going to leave behind. And also never use them outside of your home. They should be used indoors only. Every year, Wildcare gets a baby squirrels or baby opossum that's been snapped in a trap that someone placed outside. Also, if you use humane traps, love them. In the state of Massachusetts, you are required to release animals that you trap on your property back onto your property. You can't relocate them to another area. My other concern is during the summer, if you're trapping and relocating mice back onto your property, you might be leaving babies behind. So I usually tell people to do this work in the fall and winter. And obviously, if you're live trapping and re-releasing them back into your yard, you want to make sure you're removing the food attractants and finding the access points and closing them up. Otherwise, guess what? All those mice are going to go right back into your house. Will be the same ones that you're catching over and over and over again. And obviously, I don't recommend glue traps. And then just a few more alternatives. So these are some lethal alternatives other than poisons. There is a Rat X product, which is grain-based, I believe, and it coats the stomach and sends the brain a message that they are full, they don't need to eat, they don't need to drink, and the animals die by dehydration, which does not sound very nice to me, but supposedly it is humane, and there's no risk of secondary poisoning if a rat or an owl or a fox were to ingest those animals. The A24 Good Nature auto traps are becoming more popular. These are basically traps where a rat goes up into a little canister for food, and CO2 delivers a blow to their head, which kills them instantly. And it is digital, so you get information about how many animals were actually trapped in that one location in the event that predators take off with the carcasses. And I'm going through this very quickly, so I hope this information is helpful. The smart boxes by Antisimics, those are also electrocution boxes. They're being used more and more in large cities. And the dry ice rat pellets, which more and more cities are commonly using. I just want to share that dry ice pellets for rodent control is only legal in certain states. You can only purchase those products for rodent control in certain towns. Boston is one of them. So I don't want you to go out buying dry ice pellets and using that. But what people do is they put the pellets in the rat burrows, cover up the holes, and the rats suffocate. And finally, there are many different birth control products on the market now for rats and mice, and some of them are effective. I would say when you combine rodent birth control with removing the food attractants, closing up the holes, and perhaps some lethal traps like snap traps, here's where you're really solving a long-term problem. And for natural repellents, people always ask me, natural repellents do work, but typically only in small spaces is what we've learned. So, adding vinegar on the inside of a small cabinet to prevent mice from nesting there, that may work. Adding vinegar to a large room is likely not going to work because they can avoid it. And I didn't talk about it just for sake of time, but for people who have mice going into their vehicles and chewing wires, et cetera, you can use those natural repellents in your car, or there's actually a grid guard for vehicles, which is basically how do I explain it? It's like a frame of electricity that goes around your car that prevents rodents from crossing that electrical barrier, like an electric fence for livestock. So they actually sell those for cars. It is expensive, but it's incredibly effective. And I think I will be ending with the next few more slides, but I just wanted to share one of the happy stories. And this was a great horned owl that we rescued in Wellfleet. And I can tell you that when people call us about a sick great horned owl, that's not typically an animal that we would say, oh, here's how you get it into a box and bring it to us. They can be really fierce and challenging to handle. And so when you see this great horned owl here on the left slumped on the ground, you know that we have a very sick bird. And so this bird was brought to us. It checked all the boxes for rodenticide exposure. It was anemic, dehydrated, blood clotting time was very elongated. And we treated this bird for rodenticide exposure. And you can see that just within the first day, we have a brighter eyed owl on the right. And so this bird was ultimately released, which was great. So we are able to save some of them. And this slide I'm actually not going to speak to because Laura is going to speak more about this.
Yeah, I just had a quick question on the chat. They're asking about the safety of rat X as a poison that is supposed to be rat specific, but that's not supposed to contribute to secondary poisoning. Is that true?
That's true, yes. And supposedly, the company sells it by saying, oh, these animals dehydrate, and so there's less smell in your house with these dead animals, which is a kind of morbid selling point, but supposedly there's no risk of secondary poisoning.
Yeah, and then the other question was on the second generation rodenticides. And I think you mentioned that they're off the shelf for consumer use, but they're still being used by licensed exterminators. Is that what I caught right?
That's correct, yes.
All right. Good. Well,
Thank you. I think what I'll do, because we're at the half hour, and Laura's going to speak to much of this. So Laura, if you don't mind, I will let you take this over and tell people what they can do.
Sure. So do you want me to just read what you have on your slide, or do you want me to go to mine?
I think you should go to yours because it
Okay.
will address much of this.
Okay, if you're sure.
I'm sure.
Okay. So if you want to end your share, I'll put on mine. Okay. Okay. So can people see that? People can see, okay, great. And I'm gonna put my video off so I don't distract myself. So I wanted to start this off with a quote from Rachel Carson in Silent Spring, that the public must decide whether it wishes to continue on the present road, and it can only do so when in possession of the facts, which I'm hoping to give as much as I can squeeze in tonight. So a little bit of background about me and how I became involved in this issue. I know Stephanie mentioned some stuff I spoke about how 2015 was really a turning point in a lot of areas for a dramatic uptick in rodenticide use. And so a decade ago, I was walking outside of my residential building, and a pest company representative was putting 20 bait stations around my building. I have an academic background in wildlife biology, so I sort of had an idea about what these poisons were, but I wasn't extremely familiar. But I had some red flags in our correspondence. First, he kept indicating they were traps, and they weren't, they were poison. But I asked him explicitly, will this harm my pets if like my cat eats a mouse that's eaten this, or will it harm the red-tailed hawks nesting in my neighborhood? And he said, no, absolutely not. It only harms the rodents. And so I went down a rabbit hole of research starting at that point. So I'm also an environmental writer and journalist. And in 2018, I wrote my first article that's on the left for the Boston Institute of Nonprofit Journalism. And then in 2021, I did a follow-up piece, and that was also syndicated nationally in Salon. And the reason why I did a follow-up piece was, despite the fact that I had been involved in advocating on this issue for almost 6-7 years, we had several, whoa, I think I'm missing a slide. So we had our first bald eagle death in Arlington in 2021. I don't know where the slide went with her pictures, and her name was C25. She and her sibling were the first bald eagles that had hatched here in 60 years since DDT had wiped the species out of the state and most of the nation. So it was very upsetting for our town to lose one of the very first bald eagles to be hatched here. And she wasn't even the first one in the Boston metro area. Only a few months before, in Waltham, we lost another bald eagle that was nesting on the Charles, and that's her, and you can see her on the left side, and then on the right, that's her being removed. And she was discovered dead on top of her unhatched eggs. She was also still gravid and had eggs, and actually having those eggs probably is what incited her hemorrhage. Many of these animals can bleed out when they either lay eggs or give birth. And so losing those eagles, and they were both confirmed by necropsy to have died by anticoagulant rodenticides, was really an awakening for many people, including a lot of our town officials who had been, up until that point, pretty resistant about taking more aggressive action in Arlington. We also, in the spring of 2022, so about 8 or 9 months after losing C25, we also lost a family of great horned owls that were nesting in our park. It was a mother and her 2 fledglings, and even though they were not necropsied, they were showing all the classic signs of anticoagulant poisoning. They were, pouring blood out of their orifices post-mortem. And so we were pretty sure that they died. They left behind the male. For those who don't know, great horned owls often can mate for life. So it was pretty sad to watch the male kind of frantically for the next several months look for his mate. And kind of be left without a mate. And then he found one at the end of the year, but within 2 weeks, she was found on the ground and was rushed to a wildlife rehabber, but she died en route. And this time, a lot of community members in Arlington crowdfunded to have her tested, and it did show she died due to rodenticide poisoning. And so at the time, at 2022, I finally decided to form a group more formally to deal with this issue. We called ourselves Save Arlington Wildlife. We started a website because some people that I had been collaborating decided to take some warrants to Arlington, one that would ban SGARs, the second generation anticoagulants, on public lands, as well as submit a home rule petition to try to ban it on private property. And I'll explain a little bit about that a little later. But so I basically worked with my group to get people in town to write their select board members and later on their town meeting members, and we won by a landslide vote for both warrants. About 8 or 9 months after that, people from other communities started approaching me and asking to replicate kind of what Arlington did in their towns. So I would help mentor them, and about a handful of other Save Wildlife groups started forming in Belmont and Winchester and Waltham. And it really started to ratchet up after we had our second bald eagle death related to rodenticide poisoning. So the reason I chose Save Arlington Wildlife, and I think it's such a good idea for other groups to have like sort of a Save community wildlife, is because I think it really helps people understand that our communities can have rich biodiversity in our backyards, even in urban communities like Arlington, that we can have eagles and owls. And so I think it instills a sense of pride in that, and that these are also like our neighbors, not just like an abstraction, the wildlife. And it sort of speaks to that idea of thinking globally and acting locally. Oh, there's the picture of C25. I don't know why that slide shifted. So just for context, that's C25. That was the first bald eagle that died in Arlington. Those first 2 pictures are mine, of her as a nestling and hers as a fledgling. And then you can see that, unfortunately, that last picture is her as she was on her way to Tufts Wildlife Clinic, and she died only a couple of hours after she arrived. What's notable is in the middle picture I took, I don't know if people can see it, but her mother actually brought her a large rat that her and her sister devoured within minutes. And I could actually see the green dye of the rodenticide splatter against their wings, and you can see some parts of it in that picture. And that was only a couple of weeks before she passed away. Fast forward a year and a half to the end of February 2023, and C25's mother, MK, who is pretty famous in most of the state and especially the Boston metro area, also started acting ill. She was like on the ground, She wasn't going back up to her nest at night, which is a big problem for a diurnal predator like an eagle. And so she was rushed to New England Wildlife Centers, and she was showing all the typical signs of anticoagulant poisoning. Her blood wasn't clotting. She was defecating blood. And when she died, she actually died on a lung hemorrhage aspirating on her blood. They did not do a necropsy though, because she also tested positive for avian flu. And I know this has caused some controversy. People sometimes argue that she did not die of rodenticide poisoning, but it's really important to remember that flu or other diseases are not mutually exclusive to rodenticide poisoning. And a lot of times rodenticide poisoning can immunocompromise animals. So on the issue of avian flu, I actually am very concerned that it can make them more susceptible to it. Unfortunately, we're not testing the intersections of those two diseases, but I think MK is a compelling case for looking at that. The problem too is that bald eagles are still in a precarious position in our state. Again, bald eagles were extirpated in our state in 1970 due to DDT. DDT was banned in 1972, and it took over 35 years for them to get off the federally endangered species list, the eagles. And that required people like hundreds of agents had to take eggs and incubate them and hand raise chicks to be able to get the species to rebound. And recovery has been even slower here in Massachusetts. They were endangered here till 2012, and they were threatened until 2020. So only within a year of them being demoted to a species of special concern, we have several of these deaths due to anticoagulant rodenticides. And so they are still MESA listed. And even though their numbers are growing, this and avian flu and some other threats could undermine their recovery. And a nationwide study found that over 80% of bald and golden eagles have been exposed to anticoagulant rodenticides. So this is really concerning. So I've partnered with some other wildlife rehabilitation organizations such as Cape Ann Wildlife, and I started a nonprofit, Save Massachusetts Wildlife, last year. And we did for a time, I think we're going to be on hiatus now, but we were partnering with some vets to do some necropsies of animals that were discovered dead in the Boston metro area. We've necropsied about 50 of them, and virtually all of them have been exposed to anticoagulant rodenticides, and almost all of them, save a handful, they were at lethal levels of exposure and showing signs of bleeding issues, usually internal bleeding. Now, the brunt of those, the vast majority of those poisoning cases, were raptors, and that's because raptors have very rodent-heavy diets. So red-tailed hawks and barred owls were by far the largest in the set. But we also had Cooper's hawks, screech owls, we had a saw-whet owl, great horned owls, we had some coyotes and foxes, and even some unlikely candidates as well. The other problem is, from what I've heard, and I'm sure Stephanie could speak a little more to it, is that many wildlife rehabbers are telling me that they're getting more cases than they have of poisoning compared to 7 or 8 years ago. So again, prior to 2015, they weren't seeing as much. So I think that speaks to how ubiquitous these poisons have become, but also we're using a lot of different kinds of the poisons. So we're using several different escars, we're using several different of the first generations. So what happens is these animals, their system has so many different poisons, and those are having a compounding impact. And so, New England Wildlife Centers, they share this anecdote a lot. There was a family of great horned owls on Cape Cod in 2021. Both parents died. This poor owl pictured here, it was in very rough shape. They even attempted a blood transfusion, and unfortunately, he did not survive. His sibling was the only survivor, and it took, I think it was 9 months of daily vitamin K infusions for this owl's blood to clot on its own again. And that had been unprecedented. And so they're telling me, whereas treatments used to sometimes take a few weeks, sometimes they're taking months for these animals for their blood to clot on their own again. So as I mentioned, it's not just raptors. Canids like foxes and coyotes are very susceptible. A lot of our mesocarnivores like raccoons, opossums, and skunks can be very susceptible to rodenticide poisoning. Bobcats. Out in California, these poisons are felling mountain lions. So you know if these poisons are harming like something as large as a mountain lion, they're going to also harm a lot smaller species. Crows, corvids are very sensitive. They're finding poisoning in rodent-eating reptile species like certain snakes. And sometimes herons can get this as well. They do eat rats, and we did have one animal, one great blue heron in our study that had lethal levels of anticoagulant poisoning and had a severe abdominal bleed. The thing is that these rat poisons, they don't actually work. And there's several different reasons for that. They lure the rodents to the area, so it's kind of counterproductive. So rodent poison is food, and if you are leaving like lots of bait boxes everywhere, you are going to be attracting the rodent to the area if they're not already there. And you're also, if you're going to keep those bait stations there, you're incentivizing rodents to stay in that area because it is a food source. The other problem is that rats and mice can build biological resistance to these rodenticides. So similar to antibiotic resistance, you know, the more they eat this, the more that it doesn't affect them, or it can take a lot longer to kill them. The whole reason we have second generation anticoagulants is because rodents developed such a robust resistance to the first generations. So they made the second generation, and they made it so in theory, if one feeding would kill the mice or rat, but it wouldn't do it for a few days or a week, so that the rat wouldn't make a correlation and think, oh, okay, that poison's making me sick, or that poison made my other rat in my family sick, because they are smart and they can make those deductions. But the thing is, even though it doesn't, they might have one lethal dose in their first feeding, they're going to eat more and more of that for the next several days or week. Or if they're biologically resistant, they can eat these poisons for weeks or sometimes months, they've found, and still not be affected. However, their predators do not have biological resistance. So they can't eat as much for their ratio of their body weight as these rats can, because their predators just do not breed as fast and as much as rodents do, so they can't build that biological resistance. So that's a big problem. The more we're using these poisons, the more we're creating resistant rats that are going to eat more of these poisons, and it's going to have a worse impact on the food chain. The other problems is rats are smart. They learn to avoid the bait. There's even a term for it called bait shyness. So it's really hard to sometimes get them even interested in a lot of baits. And like I said, they can outbreed the poison. And the thing is, if we're killing off our natural predators, we're going to increase rodents, as Stephanie mentioned. There's even a term for it. It's called a top-down trophic cascade. So you kill the predators, you inflate their prey. So back to some of the samples that we've dealt with that were interesting and pretty upsetting to deal with. So we found a snapping turtle recently that died of rat poison in our data set. So this shows a really ubiquitous kind of infiltration into the food chain. Snapping turtles eat carrion. It could have eaten it from a dead mouse or rat near the waterways, or it could have eaten a dead bird of prey that maybe died into, and fell into a pond because of and had avian flu. We just don't know, but we do know it's pretty startling to see snapping turtles start showing these poisonings. We also had a coyote puppy that was at Brandeis University, and as you can see in that photo, this coyote puppy had a pretty severe case of mange because, again, there's a huge intersection. He had the largest body load of these poisons in his liver that I have ever seen in any animal, and he had a very large bleed in his abdomen. So Stephanie mentioned that there's an intersection with mange. I just want to give a little more explanation really quickly. Out in California, bobcats didn't even have a certain kind of mange. It was called notogenic mange until about the early 2000s. So it wasn't even affecting these populations. But then not only were they getting it, they were suddenly getting it and dying. And just to explain, felines are a little bit more resistant to anticoagulants than other types of animals, like in terms of like the anticoagulant effects, in terms of bleeding, getting bleeding issues. That doesn't mean they don't get it at all, but their bodies usually are, for whatever reason, more resilient. But these bobcats were dying to the point where some populations were getting 80% declines because of this mange. It was killing over 3/4 of some of these packs of animals. And it wasn't just the second generation anticoagulants, it was also a first generation called difascinone that was contributing to their population plummets. And in fact, that's one of the reasons California added difascinone to their prohibition. Here in Massachusetts, we recently had a gray fox that died of rodenticide poisoning. And what was interesting about that case is that the primary poison that killed this fox was actually chlorofascinone, which is a first-generation anticoagulant. I spoke to a researcher just earlier this week who told me she has done a study where she has found that gray foxes that have anticoagulant poisoning in their system, she's finding that they're more likely, if they have that poisoning, to also have canine distemper. So that's another example of these animals, their immune systems being compromised and getting sick. There was also a study in California condors that found that it made them much more susceptible to lead poisoning if they also had anticoagulant poisoning. And the more the anticoagulant poisoning they had, the more likely they were to die of lead poisoning. There's other concerning things about how these poisons are infiltrating the food chain. So there was a study done in Chicago last year of mesocarnivores, so possums, skunks, and raccoons. And the study found that all 100% of these animals, and there were 94, I think, in the study, were exposed to these poisons. And actually, many of them were getting in the bait boxes. Some of them were getting it from eating the rodents, but there was a lot of evidence that they were eating it straight from the bait boxes, which shows that these bait boxes are not as tamper resistant as people are saying. But one of those animals was a possum, and the possum had babies. So possum is a marsupial, so they found all these babies in its pouch, and 3 of the 4 joeys, so that's the picture on the left, also had anticoagulant poisoning. And it was the first time they had confirmed, and I think since then there have been some other confirmations, that mammals can actually pass on anticoagulant poisoning to their young through nursing, through their mother's milk to the babies. They also found in California a mountain lion that had been hit by a car. She was pregnant and she was almost full term, so about to give birth soon. They found that all 4 of her fetuses also had high rates of anticoagulants in their livers. So it was one of the first cases showing that mothers can pass this on to their babies in utero through through the placenta. So just more examples showing these bait stations are not very sturdy. The picture on the right is actually one that I came across, and this was during last winter and after a snowstorm, so I could actually see paw prints of what looked like a raccoon or a possum prints leading to and away from this bait box on the right. And as you can see, it looks like whatever broke into that had eaten quite a bit. That picture on the left is just from a month or so ago. At Yale University in Connecticut, they found this juvenile opossum that had broken open the bait station, gorged on the bait, and then he couldn't move. And he did survive, but he basically ate all the bait in that station. And we've had cases right here in Arlington, like someone took pictures when they saw that a family of squirrels had broken open a bait station. They were distributing the bait throughout their family, and then unfortunately, several days later, many of these squirrels were found dead in people's yards. Pets are also very susceptible to these poisonings. This is a billboard that my organization funded this summer, and those 2 animals pictured in the billboard are real pets that belong to somebody. The dog, actually a greyhound, his name was Lenny. He died because he was eating grass. His owner was staying at an Airbnb that was listed as dog friendly. There were all these bait stations, and he, like many dogs, was eating grass right by the bait station. But because there had been a lot of heavy rainstorms, the bait had actually flooded out and contaminated the grass. So he got poisoned, and unfortunately he passed away. I've spoken to MSPCA at length about this issue. They get dozens of animals to their emergency hospital every year, usually between 40 and 60, that have rodenticide poisoning. Not all of them are anticoagulants, but the vast majority of them are due to anticoagulants. The average is $5,000 or more for treatment. I've spoken to some people at other places around the country who have had to spend as much as $15,000 on vet care. It takes weeks, sometimes even a couple of months of aftercare, because again, similar to the wildlife, these poisons inhibit vitamin K in your system, and vitamin K helps your blood clot. So these animals have to take a daily dose of vitamin K, sometimes for weeks at a time, so that their blood can keep clotting until the body can finally fully expel these poisons. And when they're in acute toxicosis and they're suffering from poison, a lot of times these dogs and cats, just like people or even sometimes wildlife, they'll need blood transfusions or plasma transfusions to help them survive the ordeal. And MSPCA actually put out an urgent call to people, if they have younger dogs and cats that are relatively healthy, to please have their cats or dogs donate blood, because they need blood to do these transfusions for these cases. So just quickly, the second generation anticoagulants were banned by the USPCA, by the US EPA, for over-the-counter sales in most types of stores, like hardware stores, drug stores. However, you can still buy a big bucket of this on Amazon. Some people call it a loophole, but there's really nothing stopping people from buying this stuff online. You can still find them at what are called agricultural goods or farm and tractor stores. And sometimes, even though they're not supposed to, you can still sometimes find these at hardware stores, even though they're not supposed to be there. California currently has a moratorium on anticoagulants, both the first and second generation. Though there are some exemptions, like agriculture is a big exemption. They can still use these poisons, which is unfortunate because a lot of wildlife use agricultural areas. British Columbia has a moratorium. And I just want to say British Columbia did their moratorium for a year, and it was so successful, they permanently adopted it. And they had no net economic losses. So there was no adverse economic impacts to them, banning second generation anticoagulant rodenticides. Several other New England states like Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire have recently considered bans, but nothing has really stuck. And Vermont currently has one that's being considered at their state house, but so far it has not passed. The reason why these poisons were taken out from over-the-counter sales was because these poisons, the second generations in particular, were poisoning between 15 and 60,000 children every year. And these were by and large disproportionately low-income children of color. And the pest control and pesticide manufacturing industry fought this hard. They said that the number of kids being poisoned were an acceptable amount for the purpose of rodent control. So if you think that a lot of this industry is going to care much about wildlife, just consider the fact that they did not support even taking some of these off over the counter when kids were getting poisoned by the tens of thousands in our country. So one of the manufacturers, which was the holdout, finally agreed to take 12 of its eSCARS products off the market, off the over-the-counter market in 2014. And the EPA then stopped those sales, but they still allow pest companies to distribute these poisons in tamper-resistant bait stations virtually almost anywhere they want, even though the EPA knows that these anticoagulants are causing a lot of harm to the environment. So this was the conclusion of their 2020 ecological risk assessment, which was the last one they did, which found that the nature of risk to mammals and birds from anticoagulant rodenticides is well established, and it includes mortality from both primary and secondary exposure, as well as chronic growth and reproduction effects. So despite that being their conclusion, they still allowed the registration of these chemicals. And if you ask yourself why that is, well, because the EPA is very politicized. There's a revolving door with the industries that they regulate, and that occurs on the state level too. So many of the people in the EPA, they either worked for the pesticide or pest control industry or pesticide manufacturing industries themselves, or they go to work there after they leave their tenure at the EPA. There's been many articles, these are just a couple here on this slide, about how whistleblowers have tried to say the EPA is allowing chemicals that they should not, that are been proven to be very dangerous for public health or the environment. And then those whistleblowers get fired, or they're basically pushed into a desk job and not allowed to do any work, basically, forced to be silent about this. And so I really urge anyone who is interested in this to go look this up, and I'm glad to share articles, but ProPublica and The Intercept have both covered this extensively about what's going on in the EPA and why it's making it so hard to get better, more common sense laws about pesticides. On the state level, this also plays out too. In 2017, Tufts did a survey of, I think it was 30 pest control professionals. They found that even though all of them said that they were IPM professionals, virtually all of them still used SCARs, and usually as a first-line method. They also found that the respondents did not really understand the potency or half-life of the SCARs, so they didn't understand how toxic it was. I have spoken to dozens of pest control representatives. I've been told everything from, like, you know, an animal can't get poisoned because it's just one mouse and they barely eat any of it. Again, not considering that these mice or rats eat dozens and dozens of doses of this, that they're resistant, and that the hawks and owls and coyotes eat dozens and dozens of these animals. So it's a cumulative impact that is killing these animals. I've been told that, oh, it's a third generation anticoagulant, so it doesn't move up the food chain. There's no such thing as a third generation anticoagulant. So there's definitely seems to be a disconnect between the reality. And unfortunately, there's no laws that stop pest companies from lying or telling things that are not the truth. For my article in 2021, I asked the EPA, I shared many of these things that pest companies were telling me, that these poisons could not possibly harm wildlife, that they were safe. And they told me it's not a violation of the law for a pest company to make inaccurate claims about the impacts of their products on pets or wildlife. The National Pest Management Association works very hard on keeping rodenticides and other pesticides in circulation. And to do that, they've actually, like 30 years ago, they went around to every state and asked them to take the rights of communities away to regulate pesticides. So just so you know, before 1990, you know, your town or city could probably ban a pesticide or a rodenticide. But there was a Supreme Court case in the early 90s that said that the federal government couldn't tell a city or town what to do with that, but a state could. So the National Pest Management Association and all their state and regional lobbying arms went to all these different states and said, you can't let municipalities make decisions about what pesticides can be used on private properties in their borders. And now what that means is 46 states, this says 43, but it's 46 states to have some kind of laws saying that that communities can't just ban a pesticide on private property. The state needs to either weigh in, or in some cases you can't even appeal to the state. And that is because of that lobbying effort from the 90s. And I know that a lot of pest companies will say that it's usually consumers that are causing a lot of the problems with poisonings, but the companies that look at the global usage of pesticides and what places are using and purchasing them the most is pest control companies, as you can see in this graph. Agriculture comes in second, but you know, private consumers are a very small sliver of that. That's not to say it isn't a problem when we buy it online, or people sometimes still buy it in stores, but it is a small problem compared to the pest companies putting these bait stations everywhere. In California, I know some pest companies here in Massachusetts have been saying, oh, you know, in California, they're having a rat apocalypse right now because they have these prohibitions. But a researcher actually looked at the public records requests of rodent-related complaints and actually found that there was a steep decline subsequent to the current moratorium on anticoagulants, like a 10-year low. Now, rodents go through bust-boom cycles anyway, so it's sometimes hard to say what's causing that, but there definitely hasn't been an increase in rat problems in California since they put in their moratorium. So the problem is that if we're going to use more anticoagulants, like Stephanie mentioned before, like I already mentioned earlier, we're going to decrease the amount of natural pest control that's provided by owls and hawks and other predators. And that actually has this feedback loop, because then we're just going to keep putting down poison because we're like, oh, there's more rats, and there's more rats because we're killing off their predators. And in California, where they have this moratorium, they're doing a lot of little studies with, you know, doing owl boxes on farms, and they're finding it's pretty successful. I have only a few slides left, so I just also wanted to mention that there's actually no peer-reviewed data whatsoever that shows that anticoagulant rodenticides reduce rodents in any contiguous landscape, any metro area, any rural area. And what I mean by contiguous is the only place that they've ever shown to reduce rodents is like very small islands where they helicopter drop tons of this stuff that usually isn't inhabited by humans. And those rats and mice are not getting garbage from people, and they don't have resistance the way the ones in the mainland areas do. But they've never found that these poisons work anyplace else outside of that. And if you actually look at the data that does exist, rats and mice have increased the more we're using these poisons. Like, so if you look at the Boston metro area and the rat reports they've gotten complaints, it's actually gone up in tandem with how much poison we're using, which again speaks to probably that feedback loop that we're heightening by using these poisons. Because again, great horned owl can eat and kill 4,000 mice a year. Even the little diminutive screech owl can kill over 1,000 mice a year. There's no poison that can compete with that. But if we wipe these guys out, that's thousands of more rodents we're going to have instead in that area. The other problem is these poisons can actually undermine the public health benefits they claim to be advancing. So the argument usually is rats are a big public health risk. And that's really exaggerated, but a study from 2021 actually found that rats that have these poisons in their system are more likely to have leptospirosis and transmit it than rats that do not. And again, that speaks to the issue of the immunosuppression these poisons have. So you're going to have a more diseased rat. And then when that rat does finally die from these poisons, then you have a diseased rat that's often dying in this area of high foot traffic in the middle of the day, which a healthy rat will not do. So I've come across occasionally I'll come across a dead or dying rat. And a lot of times it's in broad daylight. Both of these pictures, there were kids within mere feet of these rats. The one on the right was dying, and this was 2 houses down from a school that had just let out with little kids walking by. So, you know, if a rat is here spitting up blood, and then it dies, and all the fleas and ticks on it are going to look for the closest host, that's not really a good way to go if you're trying to do better public health. So these poisons are making these animals die in places and ways they wouldn't otherwise, that actually make it more likely to spread disease. So instead, I think we should have prevention, sanitation, and exclusion as our mainstays, because I think that that's greater than poison. I think I have more slides than I thought. Should I, how much more time do I have? Because I don't want to take up too much time.
Yeah, we have a few more minutes, Laura, so.
I'll try to go through these pretty quickly. So
Yeah.
if we're noticing more rats in addition to the poison itself, climate change is a big part of the problem. Warmer weather means these animals are having babies year round, where usually they would not. It's also because we're urbanizing more in a lot of areas, or more people are moving into towns and there's more trash. So again, we have to fix the trash issue, or else that we're just not going to get rid of the rats. More construction can disrupt their burrows, so we'll see them more. And again, the poison itself is part of the problem. And, you know, I do think we have to interrogate a little bit about our hatred and fear of rats. There have been studies that show people who hate rats and demonize them the most are the ones who will use poison, no matter if they love other wildlife. So I really think that it's important to address that. And I do want to say a lot of these concerns about rats, though they can be valid, often are exaggerated. Like, so for instance, a lot of people tell me they're scared of rabies. Rats and mice don't spread rabies. They are not a rabies vector species. There's never been a single case of rabies between a rat and a human in North America. You know, I hear about plague a lot. There are only about 5 to 7 cases of plague in the US every year. And they're all out west. They're not in New England, and they're usually almost never from a rat. You are hundreds of times more likely to get hit by lightning than get plague from a rat. You're hundreds of times more likely to get bitten by a dog than a rat. A child is statistically much more likely to get poisoned by rodenticides than sickened by a rat. Again, that doesn't mean you should go around touching rats. They can carry leptospirosis and some other diseases. But for the most part, if you're not actively touching them, if they're not getting inside your home, the rat, you usually have a very, very, very low instance of having to be validly worried you're going to get sick from a rat. And again, the poisons could actually exacerbate those risk factors. And they're even finding out, experts, that they don't think rats now spread the Black Plague of the Middle Ages, that they're usually notoriously thought of as the vector for. They now believe it was actually human fleas and human lice and didn't have anything to do with rats. So if we want to get rid of rats and we want to reduce the ability of them to be like in our yards near us, we really have to figure out how to remove the attractants. I actually have a Forgo the Feeder program here where I ask people to take down their bird feeders between like early April and early December, because I get a lot of complaints about rats that time of year. And even if you're not going to use rodenticide to deal with the rats, a lot of times I'll have people tell me, but my neighbor is now using rat poison to deal with the rodents that my other neighbor's bird feeder is taking. So it's often just better, especially in the summer, because birds have lots of other good foods out, to take them down that time of year. Rinse out your recycling. I actually keep my compost indoors until it's time to drop it off at the drop-off facility. Pick up your pet waste. And if at all possible, try not to take your trash out at all till either the night of or the morning of pickup. On a larger scale with towns, like, you can ask for the better enforcement and signage about wildlife feeding laws, even trying to do some carry in, carry out policies. I know there's been some mixed results because they have to be well enforced. My building actually did trash pickup twice a week for a while, and that really helped when we started getting rodents. Big belly canisters. Some of this is what Stephanie's already talked about. Fertility control and smart box pilots a lot of communities are doing. They're giving out rat-resistant trash toters. Increased dumpster inspections for larger buildings and businesses can really help getting those dumpsters licensed. Doing higher fines if places are not picking up after their trash at dumpsters. Boston just did a big fine increase, and we'll see if that works. I think it will. Can really also help. To wrap up in sort of the what we can do. So my group is part of a larger coalition with several other groups like Cape Ann Wildlife, Save Lexington Wildlife, Friends of Horn Pond. We filed a legal petition in the state last year, asking the state to reevaluate the safety of these pesticides, and we want them to suspend registration. They are now doing a third-party evaluation to see if there's any validity to our claim. So in the meantime, what can you do? If you haven't already, consider starting your own Save Wildlife initiative. So, Mass Audubon has their Rescue Raptors initiative, and that's really helped ramp this up throughout the state. I think now there's 90 either Save Wildlife or Rescue Raptor initiatives. So join it if one exists already, or consider starting one. I have an activist toolkit on my website. You can talk to anyone who wants to start it. And you could do what we've done in Arlington, which is pass a public lands ban, where you ban where you can ban the poison on the public properties, and you could submit a petition to the state saying we want to ban on private property. Because again, because of the pest lobby, we can't just outright ban, but we can submit a petition to the state saying we want to ban on private property. And the more of those petitions that go to the state, the more they feel the pressure, and the more likely the state will do something. And I think right now 12 communities have now submitted home rule petitions or have them pending to be submitted since we did ours in 2022. There is a state bill right now. It's S64, 644 in the Senate side, and on the House side, it's 965 that would prohibit these poisons in the state of Massachusetts, with some small exemptions if there's a public health emergency. If you haven't yet, write your rep or senator and ask them to co-sponsor that bill. And ask them to keep supporting it if they already have, because it will need a lot more support. You can also, it's going to come up for its first committee hearing probably at the end of next month at the Committee for the Environment and Natural Resources. So also be ready for that. Check their calendar, check, my website or Stephanie's website when that comes up, and write the committee when this comes through. Also right now, The Massachusetts Department of Agricultural Resources, which is the one that has our legal petition, they're taking in public comments on this issue. And I do have more information on the Save Arlington Wildlife website. And they're taking comments till October 1st. So again, the more comments they get, the better. And just finally, there's also this app called I think it's now called the ARs Brigade. This is a little old, this slide, where you can take pictures of bait stations in your neighborhood. Obviously, don't go on anyone's private property. If it's labeled, if it's not labeled, does it have any of these poisons in it? And you can put it on the app, and so it helps give us sort of a census of these bait stations, where they are. And also sometimes we can correspond that to have there been, sick or dying animals near those bait stations. And so that's a little kind of citizen science project you can do in your own neighborhood. So I started with a Rachel Carson quote. I want to end one because everything she wrote about DDT, I feel like could be written about anticoagulants, which is, how could intelligent beings seek to control a few unwanted species by a method that contaminated the entire environment, and brought the threat of disease and death even to their own kind? Yet this is what we have done. We have done it, moreover, for reasons that collapse the moment we examine them. And if you have any questions, you can reach me on my either Save Arlington Wildlife or Save Massachusetts Wildlife. And Save Mass Wildlife, we also take donations for things like billboard campaigns and other educational campaign items. I can stop my share.
All right. Oh, thank you, Laura, Stephanie, and Martha. We did answer quite a few questions in the question and answer thing, but if there's a couple of questions that somebody has right now, you could put them in the chat or in the question and answer. We'll try to answer one or two more before we quit for the evening. So I do appreciate all the information that we just did, and to remind people that we will send an email out to everybody tomorrow evening that will have the links to the websites that were mentioned and some other information. So I had someone just raised a hand, I think. Okay, so we have more questions and answers. Yeah, do the bait boxes have to be labeled?
No.
So
I mean, so the law is pretty vague on that. If the pest company buys the bait station with the label, in theory, then they have, like with the product, then it has to be labeled, but there's no way to track that. And so, and the law doesn't specify where the label has to be. So sometimes they say it's inside the box, which then no one can see it. So effectively, no, and it's not really enforced, even that vague law. But I do
Okay.
find that many of them are labeled, not all of them, or as much as should be, but I do find a fair amount of them are.
Okay, thank you. Well, we are running a little late today. I mean, I really appreciate everybody with their questions, and maybe we can all do our own part in our own communities to make this a better world and try to eliminate some of these poisons that are affecting us all. Martha, do you have another comment?
Yeah, somebody had posted that the chat seems to be disabled. I don't know if that's true, but we posted some things, including that there.
It's still up. Yeah.
Oh, okay. There is going to be, if anybody is in Franklin County, there's going to be a new group forming, Rescue Franklin County Wildlife group, and we're having a kickoff meeting. Heather Packard will be facilitating the meeting next Monday at the Greenfield Public Library at 6 o'clock, and it is both Zoom and in person. And John posted the link. So hope that, you can join us, and it's going to be great to get a group going in Franklin County.
Yeah. And I've copied all those links, so I'll add those to our email tomorrow. All right. Well, I think that's about it for us tonight. Stephanie and Laura and Martha, thank you all for your time. And I learned a lot, and I hope everybody else did too. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and call it an evening. And thank you all for your time and energy and working on this pretty serious problem throughout the country. So thank you all.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
All right.
You.
Have a great evening. Good night, everyone.